In 1387, a man named William the Quick stood trembling in London's town square as his wrists were locked into a wooden contraption he had only heard whispered about in the darkest corners of taverns. The executioner approached slowly, almost ceremonially, and placed one calloused hand on a brass handle that jutted from the side of the device. What happened next would echo through the cobblestone streets for hours, a sound that made hardened merchants cover their ears and turn away. But here's what the history books conveniently forgot to mention. This wasn't random brutality. This was calculated, methodical, surgical precision designed by some of the greatest engineering minds of the medieval world. And by the time you reach the end of this story, you'll understand why some of the most skilled criminals in Europe actually begged for this punishment, lined up voluntarily to have their hands destroyed because what they faced as an alternative was so terrifying that living without hands seemed like mercy itself. Picture yourself walking through a crowded medieval marketplace. The air is thick with the smell of livestock and unwashed bodies pressed together in the narrow lanes between vendor stalls. You feel something, just the faintest brush against your hip, lighter than a moth's wing, and suddenly your coin purse is gone. The thief has already vanished into the sea of faces, and your entire week's wages have disappeared forever. This wasn't petty crime. This was an art form perfected over generations. Master thieves operated in organized guilds with their own codes, their own training academies, their own territories carved out across European cities. They had apprentices who spent years learning the craft, studying the subtle movements required to lift a purse without the victim feeling even the slightest tug. Their hands were precision instruments, trained to feel the difference between silk and wool in pitch darkness, to untie complex knots in seconds, to slip rings off fingers while shaking hands in greeting. These weren't desperate criminals, they were professionals, and their hands were worth more than gold. Medieval authorities faced a problem that kept them awake at night. Traditional punishments simply didn't work. Whip a pickpocket until his back was raw and bleeding. He'd be back on the streets within days, his hands still perfectly functional, his skills undiminished. Throw him in a dungeon. That cost money, required guards. And all you'd accomplished was creating a networking event for criminals to share techniques and forge alliances. Execute every thief, the bodies would pile so high that disease would spread. And besides, society needed workers, needed laborers, needed people to keep the economy functioning. So they developed something far more sinister, far more permanent. They decided that if a man's hands were his weapons, then his hands would become his prison. They would turn those precision instruments into twisted monuments of agony, living advertisements that would follow criminals through every marketplace, every street corner, every desperate attempt to beg for bread. The three methods they created weren't just torture devices. They were psychological warfare, economic destruction, and social engineering combined into instruments of unthinkable cruelty. What makes this story truly horrifying isn't just the brutality of what they did, it's how carefully they planned it. Medieval engineers approached the destruction of human hands with the same meticulous attention to detail they used to design cathedral arches and siege weapons. They tested different materials, calibrated pressure points, measured angles and force with mathematical precision. They didn't want criminals to die quickly. They wanted them to survive, to live long lives carrying permanent proof of their crimes on their bodies. And if you think you understand where this story is going, if you think you've already imagined the worst of what they did, then you haven't been paying attention. Because what I'm about to reveal makes everything you've heard so far seem almost gentle by comparison. If this story has already gotten under your skin, if you can feel the weight of these dark historical truths settling into your bones, then do me a favor and subscribe to this channel, because the histories they tried to bury, the methods they hoped we'd forget, the uncomfortable truths about human nature and justice that make us question everything we thought we knew, those are the stories I bring to light. And trust me, what comes next will make you grateful you have steady hands to hit that subscribe button. The first punishment looked almost innocent from a distance, just wooden stocks like something you might see at a festival, the kind where people pose for photographs and laugh. But medieval court records from 14th century London reveal something that stops your breath when you read it closely. These weren't ordinary stocks. Hidden within the wooden planks were iron spikes, positioned with surgical precision exactly where a person's palms would rest when their hands were locked into place. When they first secured your wrists, you could stand comfortably, almost defiantly. You could meet the eyes of the crowd, show them you weren't afraid. But then the hours began to stretch. 1 hour became 2, 2 became 4, and slowly, inevitably your legs would begin to tremble. Your knees would start to buckle. Your body would sag downward, and as it did, your full weight would drive your palms down onto those waiting spikes, piercing straight through the meat of your hands. The genius of this torture was choice. You could stand for 12, 15, 18 hours straight, and maybe, just maybe, keep your hands intact. Or, you could give in to the exhaustion, let gravity do its work, and permanently destroy the tools that had made you a fortune. William the Quick lasted 8 hours before his legs finally gave out. The court records describe the sound with clinical detachment, like a butcher's cleaver striking bone, and the crowd that had gathered to mock him fell silent. Some turned away, Others couldn't stop watching. The psychological warfare extended beyond the physical pain. Citizens were encouraged to participate, to throw stones and rotting vegetables, to deliberately bump into the pillory and cause the victim to lose balance. Every time William flinched, every time someone shoved the wooden frame, his palms would drive deeper onto those iron spikes. The scarring was permanent and distinctive, symmetrical puncture wounds that marked him as a former pickpocket for the rest of his life. This was medieval society's database, their fingerprint system centuries before technology would make such things routine, but authorities quickly discovered a problem. Some thieves adapted. They learned to work with damaged hands, or they switched to different crimes that didn't require the same dexterity, so they escalated. For repeat offenders, they developed something that went beyond temporary pain and scarring. They developed permanent branding. Imagine heated iron pressed into your palm, held there for exactly 3 seconds while the smell of your own burning flesh filled your nostrils. The letter T for thief seared so deep into your right palm that you could never hide it, never escape it, never shake a hand or buy bread or hold a child without everyone seeing exactly what you were. Massachusetts court documents detailed the procedure with disturbing precision, specifying the exact temperature of the iron, the exact duration of contact, the exact amount of pressure required to ensure the brand would penetrate the full thickness of skin and leave a permanent mark that could not be concealed or removed. Different colonies used different letters, creating an interstate criminal identification system. T for thief in Massachusetts, R for rogue in Virginia, B for burglar in Pennsylvania. Branded thieves developed elaborate methods to hide their marks. Wearing gloves in summer heat, keeping their hands buried in pockets, learning to shake hands with their backs turned. Some even attempted self-mutilation, cutting deeper wounds to try to obscure the brand letters. But nothing worked. The mark followed them everywhere, destroying any chance of honest employment, any hope of marriage into respectable families, any possibility of escaping their past. Yet even this wasn't enough, because by the early 16th century, some criminals continued to steal despite the brands, despite the scars, despite every warning society had carved into their flesh. So authorities developed the final solution, the one that makes everything else seem almost merciful by comparison. A German executioner named Franz Schmidt kept a diary, and in its pages he described what he called the hand engine. It was a spring-loaded contraption with 2 iron plates connected by adjustable screws, designed to systematically crush every bone in a human hand while keeping the victim conscious throughout the entire 47-minute procedure. Schmidt's notes read like a technical manual, describing how the device crushed each finger bone in sequence, beginning with the smallest joints and proceeding methodically toward the wrist. He had tested it, refined it, perfected the pressure settings to ensure maximum pain without causing death from shock. Victims could watch their own hands being destroyed bone by bone. The device was positioned so they wouldn't miss a single moment, wouldn't be spared a single crack or splinter. Court records describe crowds of 400 people gathering to witness these spectacles, listening to screams that could be heard 3 streets away. Survivors were left with hands that looked like twisted claws, bones healed at wrong angles, fingers that could never again grip anything with precision. They became living warnings, begging in marketplaces with their mangled appendages held out for coins, visible proof of what happened to those who chose theft. But here's what makes this story take its darkest turn. Professional thieves didn't just endure this punishment, many of them chose it. They volunteered for it. They lined up and begged for the hand engine because the alternative was public execution by hanging, often preceded by hours of additional torture that made hand crushing look gentle. Court records revealed the brutal mathematics. Hangings had a survival rate of less than 50% due to rope failures and executioner incompetence. But survival meant facing even worse punishments, while death meant slow strangulation that could last 20 minutes or more. A master thief named Heinrich Zimmermann, in his 1489 confession, explained the logic with chilling clarity. He said he chose the hand engine because he had seen men dance on air for 20 minutes before dying, had seen ropes break and leave men half strangled, only to be hanged again. Better to live without hands than die with them. This created something historians tried to bury. Former criminals with destroyed hands became valuable informants, intelligence gatherers who understood how theft networks operated but could no longer participate in them. Medieval Europe's first organized crime informants were men whose hands had been systematically crushed by the very authorities they now served. The system was so effective that by 1550 it had collapsed under its own success. So many professional thieves had chosen mutilation that organized crime networks simply fell apart. There were enough functional hands left to maintain the sophisticated theft operations that had plagued European cities for centuries. The devices disappeared not because society became more humane, but because they had worked too well. They had eliminated the criminals they were designed to punish, forcing crime to evolve beyond the reach of physical mutilation into fraud, blackmail, and confidence schemes that didn't require manual dexterity. Medieval justice achieved its goal through the most brutal means imaginable and accidentally taught criminals that the human mind could be far more dangerous than the human hand. But here's what should genuinely terrify you. We never really stopped. In 2024, several nations still practice judicial hand amputation for theft. The methods have become more clinical, more sterile, but the principle remains identical. Destroy the tool, destroy the crime. Medieval Europe's brutal experiment proved that targeting specific body parts could reshape criminal behavior. The question isn't whether these punishments worked. Historical evidence proves they did. The question is whether any civilization should define justice as the systematic destruction of human bodies, even when those bodies belong to criminals. So I want you to think about something before you go. If you were facing life in prison or losing your hands, which would you choose? And more importantly, what does your answer reveal about the nature of justice, mercy, and what it means to be human? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because this question has haunted philosophers and lawmakers for 800 years, and it still doesn't have an easy answer.